You see that chopper over there? That's our ride.
Are you sure about this, son?
Sir, with all due respect, this is a restricted area. The voice was young, sharp, and dripping with condescension. And you're a little too old to be playing with a $50 million war machine. Jones Morgan, 82 years young, didn't flinch. He remained perfectly still, his worn hands resting on the chain-link fence that separated the public viewing area from the active flight line. His gaze was fixed on the machine parked on the tarmac, an AH-64 Apache helicopter, looking like a prehistoric insect carved from obsidian and anger. Its lines were both familiar and alien to him, a descendant of a ghost he knew intimately. His breathing was even, his posture relaxed. He was a pillar of calm in the swirling activity of the airbase open house. A second figure, a master sergeant with a jaw so tight it could crack walnuts, stepped up beside the young lieutenant. "Sir, Lieutenant Miller is right. I need you to step back behind the public line. Now." His name tag read Davis. His eyes were hidden behind mirrored sunglasses, but his rigid stance broadcasted pure, unadulterated annoyance. The small crowd of families and aviation enthusiasts nearby began to notice the low-grade confrontation. A few phones were raised, not yet recording, but ready. It was a classic scene, authority hassling an old man who seemed a little lost. Whispers started to ripple through the onlookers. "Poor guy, probably confused. Think he's a vet? Maybe, but he shouldn't be over there." Lieutenant Miller took another step forward, emboldened by the sergeant's presence in the small audience. "Look, Pop, I get it. You probably flew one of those old wooden biplanes back in the day, right? Maybe a Huey. This is a little different." He gestured expansively at the Apache. "See all these sensors? The Hellfire missiles? This isn't a tractor you can just hop on. It's a complex weapon system and you are a security risk." Jones slowly turned his head, his pale blue eyes finally meeting the lieutenant's. There was no anger in them, only a deep, placid clarity, like looking into the sky at altitude. He said nothing. This silent dignity seemed to infuriate Miller more than any argument could have. It was a language the young officer didn't understand and therefore couldn't dominate. "ID." Now Sergeant Davis barked, his patience gone. "Base security protocol. Anyone this close to the flight line needs to be credentialed." With a slow, deliberate motion that spoke of joints stiffened by time and G-forces, Jones reached into the pocket of his old brown leather jacket. He didn't produce a military ID or a special guest pass. He pulled out a simple, worn leather wallet, and from it his state driver's license. He handed it to the sergeant. Davis snatched it, his eyes scanning the plastic card with theatrical suspicion. "Jones Morgan, no affiliation listed." He handed it back with a dismissive flick. "This doesn't mean anything here. Sir, for the last time, I need you to leave this immediate area or I will be forced to escort you." "Hey, what's that on your jacket?" Miller asked, his eyes narrowing on a small faded patch sewn onto the left breast of Jones's jacket. It was dark, the threads worn, the design nearly indecipherable from a few feet away. "Some kind of biker club. You and your buddies ride in for the show." Jones's gaze drifted down to the patch. His hand rose and his fingers gently, almost reverently, brushed against the worn threads. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The world around him seemed to melt away, the sounds of the airbase open house fading into a dull roar, replaced by a much more immediate, visceral symphony of memory. The air smelled of hot metal, ozone, and the cloying sweetness of jet fuel in a desert climate. The world outside the cockpit was a terrifying, rushing blur of sand and rock illuminated only by the ghostly green glow of the instrument panel. The rhythmic, life-affirming thump-thump-thump of the main rotor blades was a physical presence, vibrating through the seat, up his spine and into the base of his skull. It was the heartbeat of the beast he was riding. A voice tense and crackling with static shouted in his helmet. "Target acquired. 2 clicks bearing 090. They're lighting us up." Below, a stream of green tracer fire reached up for them like crooked fingers from the darkness. The memory was less than a second long, a flash of pure, compressed experience, but it was everything. It was the world where that patch was born. He blinked, and the bright sterile daylight of the airbase snapped back into focus. Lieutenant Miller was standing closer now, his personal space invasion complete. "Did you hear me, old man? I asked you a question. Are you deaf?" It was at that moment that a different set of eyes found the scene. Chief Warrant Officer 2 Evans was standing 30 yards away, near a static display of a Black Hawk. He was on a break, enjoying the sunshine. At first, he dismissed the scene as a run-of-the-mill interaction between overzealous junior leadership and a civilian, but something held his attention. It was the old man's posture, the way he stood. He wasn't scared or confused. He was rooted to the spot, his shoulders back, his head held high. It was the stance of a man who had faced far worse things than an arrogant lieutenant and a grumpy NCO. Evans was a pilot himself. He recognized the way the old man's eyes weren't just looking at the Apache, they were dissecting it. He was scanning the rotor assembly, the TAD's PNVS sensor turret, the exact placement of the missile pylons. It wasn't the gaze of a tourist, it was the gaze of an expert, an operator. Curiosity piqued. Evans began to walk slowly toward the group, keeping a respectable distance. He wanted a better look at the patch Miller had mentioned. The crowd shifted slightly, and for a brief moment, the sun hit the old leather jacket just right. The design on the patch, though faded, became clear to him. A winged dagger superimposed over a full moon, with a barely legible inscription underneath. Evans froze. His blood ran cold. It couldn't be. He'd only ever seen that insignia in grainy declassified photos and in history books about special operations aviation. It was the stuff of legend, a unit that officially never existed, the precursor to all modern Army night-flying units. A ghost unit. His heart began to pound against his ribs. This was no confused civilian. This was a piece of living history, and these two idiots were treating him like a vagrant. Evans knew he couldn't just walk up and countermand a lieutenant and a master sergeant. It would be a chaotic mess of rank and protocol. He needed a bigger gun, a much bigger gun. He backed away slowly, pulling out his phone. His fingers flew across the screen, not to record, but to Google the insignia, just to be absolutely certain. The first result was a restricted access historical military site. The title read, Project Nightwing, the Ghost Pilots of Task Force 160. His breath hitched. He turned his back to the scene, his thumb hovering over the contact for the base command post. He knew this was a massive overreach of his authority, a call that could get him in serious trouble. But the alternative, letting this disaster unfold, was unthinkable. He pressed the call button. Base operations. This is CW2 Evans. His voice was tight, urgent. I'm on the flight line, public viewing area. I need to be patched through to the base commander's office. It's an emergency. There was a pause on the other end. Warrant officer, is this a medical or security emergency? It's about to be a security emergency of a kind you can't even imagine, Evans said, his voice low and intense. Just put me through. Tell them it's about Jones Morgan. The line clicked and a new voice, female and professional, answered. Colonel Wallace's office, this is her aide speaking. Ma'am, Evans said, his words tumbling out. This is CW2 Evans. I'm on the flight line. You're not going to believe this, but I think the Jones Morgan is here. Yes, that Jones Morgan. And Lieutenant Miller and Master Sergeant Davis are about to try and arrest him. A beat of stunned silence on the other end of the line confirmed that the name had landed like a bomb. The cavalry was on its way. Inside the sprawling headquarters building, Colonel Wallace, a woman whose entire career was built on unshakable composure, felt her world tilt on its axis. Repeat that, warrant officer, she said into the phone, her voice dangerously calm. She listened, her eyes widening with each word from Evans. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the receiver. She processed the information, the location, the confrontation, the name, Jones Morgan. She didn't say goodbye. She slammed the phone down into its cradle with a crack that made her aide jump. Get me the wing commander. Now, she barked, her voice a whip crack in the quiet office. She pointed at another subordinate. Find General Peterson's personal cell number. The retired one. Tell his aide it's a Pale Rider event. Yes, that's what I said. Pale Rider. Move. The aide, a young captain, looked utterly bewildered. Ma'am, Pale Rider. It's a legacy code from his old command. It means one of the originals is in trouble. Now do it. Wallace was already shrugging off her casual office blouse and reaching for her immaculate dress uniform jacket hanging on the back of her door. The serene, administrative atmosphere of the office had shattered, replaced by the frantic, focused energy of a combat operations center. The name Jones Morgan was being whispered between staffers, a name that carried the weight of myth. For him to be on their base, being harassed by their people, was not just an embarrassment, it was a sacrilege. Back on the tarmac, the temperature of the confrontation had reached its boiling point. Miller, fed up with Jones's stoicism, saw it as a challenge to his authority in front of a growing audience. He had to end this, and he had to win. All right, old man, that's it, Miller said, his voice loud for the crowd to hear. You're a security risk. You're either dangerously senile, or you're a spy, and either way you can't be here. He turned to the sergeant, his face set in a mask of grim determination. Sergeant, cuff him. We'll take him in for processing. Maybe a nice long chat with base security will jog his memory about who he is and where he belongs. It was a flagrant abuse of power, But for Davis, it was a direct order from a superior officer. Years of training kicked in. You follow the orders of the officer in charge. He grimly pulled a pair of heavy-duty zip-tie cuffs from his belt pouch. "Sir, I am ordering you to place your hands behind your back," Davis said, his voice flat and robotic. "Do not make this difficult." He took a step forward, the plastic ties held ready. The crowd gasped. This had crossed a line, from a simple verbal dispute into something ugly. Jones didn't move. He just watched the sergeant approach, his expression unreadable. He had faced down enemy soldiers, mechanical failures at 1,000 feet, and the vast unforgiving darkness of hostile nights. A man with a piece of plastic was the least of his worries. Before Davis's hand could touch Jones's jacket, a sound sliced through the air, sharp and urgent. It wasn't a police siren. It was the high-pitched, piercing wail of a command vehicle, a sound reserved for generals and base commanders. Head snapped toward the source of the noise, a gleaming black sedan, with the colonel's eagle insignia on the bumper and small flags fluttering from the fenders, was racing down the service road, scattering civilians. It was followed closely by 2 olive-drab military police Humvees, their lights flashing. The small convoy screeched to a halt just yards from the scene, doors flying open before the vehicles had fully stopped. Colonel Wallace emerged from the sedan, her uniform jacket perfectly buttoned, her expression a thundercloud. She moved with a speed and purpose that was terrifying to behold. Behind her, military policemen in full gear disembarked from the Humvees, rifles held at a low ready, professionally and efficiently creating a perimeter, forcing the gawking crowd back. The entire situation transformed from a minor disturbance into a major, high-level incident in the space of 10 seconds. Colonel Wallace marched past the utterly bewildered Lieutenant Miller and Master Sergeant Davis as if they were invisible statues. She didn't spare them a glance. Her entire focus was on the old man in the leather jacket. She stopped precisely 2 feet in front of Jones Morgan, the air crackling with tension. The crowd, the base, the world went silent. She drew herself up to her full height. In a single flawless motion, she raised her right hand to her brow, her fingers perfectly aligned, her arm locked. It was the sharpest, most impeccably executed salute of her entire decorated career. "Mr. Morgan," she said, her voice ringing out clear and strong for everyone to hear. "It is an absolute honor to have you on my base, sir." Miller and Davis were frozen, their minds unable to process the scene. The world had turned upside down. The colonel held the salute, turning her head just enough to fix her icy glare on her 2 subordinates. "Lieutenant, Sergeant," she began, her voice dropping to a dangerously low temperature. "Do you have any idea, any concept at all of who this man is?" She didn't wait for their stammering attempts to answer. "This is Jones Ghost Morgan. He was the lead experimental test pilot for the Nightwing program back when it was so classified it didn't have a name. He is the reason the $50 million war machine you were so worried about even exists. He wrote entire chapters of the flight manual for the Apache's prototype with his own blood, sweat, and guts flying in places our country still denies we were ever in." She gestured toward the faded patch on Jones's chest. "That patch you were mocking, Lieutenant? That is the original insignia for Task Force 160. Before they were the famous 160th SOAR, the Night Stalkers, they were a handful of phantom pilots learning to own the dark. Mr. Morgan has more combat flight hours in unlit hostile territory than every single pilot in your squadron combined. He is not a guest here. He is a founder. He is a living legend. Now both of you step back." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Phones were up again, but this time they were recording a moment of history, of profound public vindication. The other airmen in the crowd stared, their jaws hanging open. CW2 Evans, standing at the edge of the cleared perimeter, let out a slow breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, a look of immense relief and pride on his face. Colonel Wallace finally dropped her salute, but her fury was undiminished. She turned its full force on Miller and Davis, who looked as if they were about to be physically ill. "You were about to place a national hero in restraints. On my base, your careers, gentlemen, are currently on life support, and I am standing here with my hand on the plug. You will both be in my office at 1600 hours, in your dress uniforms, to articulate in no less than 500 words why you believe you are still worthy of wearing the uniform of the United States Army." Dismissed. They practically fled, their faces pale, their careers flashing before their eyes. In the sudden quiet, Jones Morgan finally spoke. His voice was raspy with age, yet it carried an undeniable authority that silenced everyone. He looked at Colonel Wallace, a faint, kind smile touching his lips. "Colonel, they were just doing their jobs. A little overzealous, maybe. The protocols are there for a good reason." He then turned his gaze back to the Apache, his eyes soft with affection. She's a beautiful machine. You've all taken good care of her." He then looked toward the retreating figures of Miller and Davis. "Respect isn't about the uniform you happen to be wearing today," he said, his voice carrying to everyone listening. "It's about the legacy you honor. Never forget the people who paved the road you're driving on." As he spoke, he gently touched the faded patch on his jacket one more time. The world flickered again, another flash echo from the past. He was younger, his face streaked with grime and sweat in a makeshift briefing tent lit by a single bare bulb. A grizzled cigar-chomping commander, a man who looked like he'd been carved from oak, was pressing the freshly embroidered patch into his hand. "We don't exist, Morgan," the commander had growled. "This unit, this mission, none of it is real. This little piece of cloth is the only proof we were ever here. You wear it for the ghosts, you hear me? For the men who won't be coming back." The fallout from the incident was swift and decisive. Colonel Wallace, true to her word, instituted a new mandatory training program across the entire base. It focused on military heritage, the history of their specific branch, and most importantly, how to recognize and respectfully interact with the veterans of past generations. The story of Jones Ghost Morgan and the two chastened junior leaders became a cautionary tale, required knowledge for every airman reporting to the base. Miller and Davis were not discharged. Instead, they were reassigned to logistical duties and given a long, arduous probationary period where they had to personally oversee the new heritage program. The public humiliation was a far more effective punishment than any official reprimand. After the crowd dispersed, Colonel Wallace turned to Jones with a look of profound respect. "Mr. Morgan," she said, her tone much softer now. "I'd like that very much, Colonel." For the next hour, Jones Morgan held court. He walked around the Apache not as a tourist but as a creator returning to his creation. He ran his hand along the composite fuselage, pointing out a barely visible rivet pattern to the colonel and a small, now reverent group of senior pilots who had gathered. "We had an issue with harmonic vibrations right here on the prototype," he explained. "Had to reinforce the entire section with a new alloy. Looks like you figured out a better way." He tapped the glass of the cockpit. "Is the symbology still green? We argued about that for weeks. I always said green was easiest on the eyes at night." He didn't boast. He spoke with the quiet pride of a father checking in on a child who had grown up to be successful. He declined the offer to sit inside. "No," he said gently. "My time in that seat is over. It's enough just to see her up close." Weeks passed. One quiet Tuesday morning, a deeply humbled Lieutenant Miller was sitting in a booth at a local diner, stirring his coffee before his shift. The door chimed, and he glanced up. Jones Morgan walked in, moving with the slow, steady gait of an old man, and took a seat in a booth by the window alone. Miller's heart hammered in his chest. He could have just paid his bill and left, but the old man's words on the tarmac had echoed in his head ever since. Never forget the people who paved the road. Taking a deep, fortifying breath, Miller stood up and walked over to the veterans' table. He stood at a modified position of attention. "Sir," he said, his voice quiet and stripped of all its former arrogance. "Lieutenant Miller, I just wanted to apologize, again, for my conduct at the airbase. What you said that day, it stuck with me." Jones Morgan looked up from his menu, his pale blue eyes holding no trace of malice. He simply studied the young man for a moment, then gestured with his hand to the empty seat across from him. "Sit down, son," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The coffee's good here. Tell me what you fly." The story of Jones Morgan reminds us that heroes walk among us, often unseen. If you were moved by his quiet strength, hit that like button, share this story of valor, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more tales of unassuming heroes.